Okay, good morning. This is the July 30, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Welcome everybody to our last meeting of July, which is wild. On our agenda today, we've got a pretty packed agenda. We're going to do some administrative stuff to begin with, and hoping Jane can give us a report from the Climate Council meeting this Monday, where the draft pathways and recommendations were presented. And we can have some discussion around that. Then we're going to spend some time looking at the coming month and kind of our next steps to move our work forward. Then spend some time talking about stakeholder engagement and brainstorming strategies there. Then we've got some guests from the Cadmus group team who are working to develop a carbon budget for the Climate Council that are going to provide a initial overview of that work in advance of a task group meeting later in August to kind of drill into the details. Then we'll hopefully have some time for some general group chat, unstructured discussion, and then we'll set our agenda for next week and hear from the public. So that's the run of show this morning, and we'll start off with approving that agenda and the minutes from last week. So does anyone have any comments about the agenda or minutes? Seeing a bunch of stoic faces, I think we're good. So we'll consider those approved. So Jane, do you want me to pass this over to you for the Climate Council update from Monday?
Sure. Happy to kick it off and then encourage others who are present to follow up. So morning, everybody. It has been a busy week. Monday's Climate Council meeting was a really exciting milestone, of course, that you were all intimately part of. So it was a really great meeting and discussion around, albeit maybe a bit too packed with all the presentations, but we were able to hear first and foremost at the beginning of the meeting from a woman named April Mendez that I just didn't want to forget to mention, because I really found her presentation really thoughtful and interesting, and have been thinking about how to pull her into further conversations with certain sectors of the Climate Council's work. But if folks don't remember, at the beginning of every Climate Council meeting, we've been holding space in order to visit and lean into the equity conversation and how this work plays out in our body of work. And so April Mendez is the CEO of Greenprint Partners, and she thinks a lot about equity and technical design and how you marry the two. And I thought she had a really great presentation on revisiting, rebranding the work of stormwater design, other engineering projects, and how we think about community engagement and community benefit from those. She was really great, and she happens to be under contract now with the Agency of Natural Resources, DC's program, thinking about how we do this better in Vermont. So hoping we can tap into her more, but it was a great kickoff to the meeting, albeit I wish she could have stayed longer and had a longer conversation with us all, but we transitioned pretty quickly into the presentations from the three subcommittees tasked with speaking to the pathways, and then subset of strategies intended to illuminate the pathways put forward. I felt like it was all really well received, and if anything, albeit cross-sector got shortchanged a bit at the end for substantive conversation, because the meetings went a bit long, the presentations went a bit long, and cross-sector in particular went a bit long and bled into their time for discussion. But the intent of the discussion across all three of the presentations was intended to illuminate any glaring gaps in ideas that council members thought subcommittees would be addressing. Didn't really hear much on gaps yet. It didn't spark a lot of conversation around big omissions, and then also tried to think about where issues were cross-cutting across multiple subcommittees so that we could elevate those in the name of informing policy and recommendations, but also start to think about how we're going to cultivate those cross-cutting ideas. And then we also tried to identify through conversation where any ideas might actually be in conflict of each other, and didn't really hear much on that either at this time. So at the end of the conversation, comments were taken both during the meeting as well as in a Google Doc that council members had until today to put any ideas or comments into. Marion and I were just meeting before this meeting with David Plum and thinking about how we'll synthesize those comments along with the public comment that we get through the website, of which there's been a significant uptick since the presentations on Monday, as well as actually in the week leading up to that, so that next week we'll be prepared, as we illustrated in the timeline with the council on Monday, to share with you all substantive feedback, if any, with you on your pathways and strategies to date, and then hopefully be able to also reference public comment and think about a good way to be more substantively and continuously addressing public comment from this point on, recognizing that we want to do a good job of thinking about public comment, and there has been such an uptake of how many comments we're getting a day on the website right now. And so that is forthcoming. Also, as we spoke about at the council meeting related to pathways and strategies, we thought about what was next for the subcommittees, and that will sort of bleed into the conversation today about work planning for the subcommittee for the next month, but really thinking about how we define a vision and likely, if possible, a measurable goal for the work of ag and ecosystems and rural resilience in order to ultimately inform what strategies and ultimately get actions, and what strategies get elevated for inclusion for like short-term action in the climate action plan, and what are components of strategies that will be sort of put down for further refinement the way the climate action plan is set up. So we'll start to talk about that later on your agenda. We also spoke about how the Climate Council is going to meet over the course of the next few months. The Climate Council come September will be moving to bi-monthly meetings in recognition that your work will be sort of funneling up into the Climate Council for their subsequent approval and inclusion in a climate plan. And so we're currently polling the Climate Council around what the best date and time are for those meetings, assuming that they stay remote, and then also recognize that there'll likely be a few strategic Climate Council meetings where we want to gather in person, and we'll do further refinement of what those meetings are, if any, with the steering committee at their next meeting, and then do further scheduling to accommodate folks having to build in drive time for those meetings. So that was really the bulk of the meeting. The meeting was the presentations, and those presentations have now been passed on to Climate Access and RISE, who you'll remember are our public engagement consultants, and they're drawing on your presentations to build their collateral for the larger statewide meetings that they plan to hold in the month of September. So you'll have a chance to see that collateral later this month before it's sort of ready for prime time. But those presentations are really going to be key to that, those presentations that we share with the public come September. So a really great piece of work right now. So I'll pause there and ask Abby, Lauren, Billy, anybody else who was at the meeting if they want to add on to anything I just suggested.
I don't have much to add, just that I'm realizing now that I need to get my comments in that document, don't I? I get to do that. I'm sorry.
I think the only thing I would add is that I was struck with, there was I think a lot of kind of good mutual agreement and positive overlap amongst the kind of three presentations, especially around issues related to smart growth and incentivizing development in existing settled areas and protecting the working and natural lands outside of those. I think from a rural resilience, from our perspective, and from a emissions reduction perspective, all three of the subcommittees seem to touch on that. So that was very encouraging. And I think just supports the fundamental work that we've been doing all along.
And I would just add to elevate Iris's good comment, which I think was probably the best comment of the whole council meeting, with respect to funding and the statement that a budget creates around values, and the fact that we haven't really gotten there yet, and it's really going to be where we put, the money and where, I don't know what the phrase is, walk the walk, talk the talk kind of thing. So just in recognition that in addition to the governance issues that Billy just brought up, that there's a big lift ahead of us as far as how we intend to support our efforts with funding, both respect to ARPA, the potential for, a big infrastructure budget, and to Iris's, again, good point, not just those one-time funds, but creating sustainable pots of funding that we can tap into to make sure that we're actually moving the needle on the 3 different pillars of climate action.
Great.
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Judy, go ahead.
I apologize for not making the meeting on Monday. I have a husband who's ill right now, but I did see the news, and they mentioned again electric cars and Hydro-Quebec, and I'm really concerned about that. I'm going to put a link to an article in the chat because it's talking about the impacts of Hydro-Quebec growing on Indigenous groups in Canada. And I want to make sure that we're taking into consideration all of these, the equity and on all people, and in this case globally, when we're talking about Canada, and how our goals will be impacting others. It's kind of frightening to see community after community losing their homes, not having fresh water, not having electricity, and living right next door to Hydro-Quebec. And it's something that we need to consider as we keep pushing forward the idea of electric cars. That's fine if we can find some alternative other than something sustainable to maintain them.
I would draw your attention, I meant to, Judy, actually in your email, but next Wednesday, the Science and Data Committee will be reviewing the greenhouse gas inventory report. And so there are, fundamental components of the critique of how we track our greenhouse gases emissions that will be discussed at the Science and Data Committee, which will speak a lot to life cycle emissions and get at your comments about Hydro-Quebec specifically and other energy consumption and how we track it in the greenhouse gas inventory. So I should, if there will be a recommendation around sort of the component that you're speaking to, that will come from the Science and Data Committee. And that is also on tap for the next Climate Council meeting at the end of August for Science and Data to present on their recommendations. So some of the stuff with the greenhouse gas inventory will be, I imagine, changes that ANR, who's tasked with completing the greenhouse gas inventory, will just accept and say, we're going to do this because we think we should be doing it and we should be doing this better. And that conversation will happen at Science and Data this month. And then some of the things I suspect will metamorphosize into larger recommendations about how we should be tracking our emissions that ANR won't, I imagine, won't address right away, and it'll come in the form of a recommendation from the Climate Council. So if you're really interested in that, next week's Science and Data Committee meeting will be really illustrative about how we do our greenhouse gas inventory now, how our neighboring states do it, and how some other states do it around consumption-based inventories versus supplemental life cycle emissions.
Thank you. I'm just concerned about talking and touting how equitable we want to be if we're not going to really consider being fair and equitable to all. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments or discussion from the meeting on Monday? Well, I just want to go ahead, Abby.
I'm trying to think about how to, but to Judy's point, I think, oh, I'm just going to say the thing I shouldn't, or well, if this is going, if we are genuinely interested in facilitating a just and equitable transition, that is going to mean examining things in new ways and asking really hard questions. I am at this point still concerned that we are not ready and willing to do that. And I hope that we can get there, because it doesn't, fundamentally, I don't understand how we can claim to be meeting our goals when we're just pushing the effects off on people elsewhere. And I, really want to encourage all of us to be thinking broadly about how we're crafting the way that we go about engaging in this transition. That's all.
Well, I do want to just pause here and, appreciate how far we have all come as a subcommittee and the tremendous amount of work you all have put in over the past number of months to get to this point. Obviously, as Judy suggests, now is when we're really going to need to kind of deal with the harder questions and grapple with the real work of how to move these recommendations forward in an equitable way and for them to be successful. But, we've done a tremendous amount of work. We've come together as a group. We've really gone through a lot to get to where we are now. So I just want to pause and, thank you all for your commitment so far and acknowledge we still got a lot of work to do, but this was an important milestone. And it was great to see the work well received and it was consistent with, all the other subcommittees. So thanks, and, keep going. So with that, I guess we'll move on to the next topic, which really is this kind of forward look of what we need to do next. And, Jane, I don't know if you want to kind of frame this at all, but, basically we'll get some comments back from the council on our pathways and the representative strategies that we presented earlier in the week. And then we really need to focus on moving forward a final suite of pathway strategies and action items by the end of the summer, early fall. And, to get there, I think we need to do a number of things. We both need to kind of refine those specific recommendations. But as we've discussed, I also think we need to step back a little bit, especially in, maybe in August, and help define what our goals and vision are for the outcomes of our work. Determine whether we want to have any metrics or kind of more quantitative goals that we're striving for, similar to the targets that are set forth in the Act for Emission Reductions, and then really frame and prioritize our recommendations under that vision and goal. I think we also need to think about which of our strategies and action items are pressing and ready to go for this initial plan, and which are ones that can be framed as longer term but critical actions and strategies that need additional work to be pursued in a more concrete way, in an actionable way in the next plan. So those are all things that I'm thinking we need to do in the coming month. And probably a starting place for that is really taking all of the strategies developed by the three or four task groups, and reconciling all of those into one list, understanding that there's quite a bit of overlap. Many of the task groups have come up with similar strategies. And I think really kind of boiling them down to one book of work will be an important step for us to move forward. We still need to discuss and consider how we apply the MCA tool, equity screens, and all of that. So we've got quite a bit of work ahead of us. And I think Pat Field will join us next week to kind of dig into that work planning in a more concrete and prescriptive way. But I think today the goal is just to kind of talk generally about what we all think is necessary to move from where we are today to a comprehensive set of recommendations in the early fall. And before I open up the discussion, I don't know if Abby or Jane or Marion, you have anything you want to add to that?
I think that was a really good synopsis, Billy. I do think that the way that specifically for ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, I'll just suggest that the hope would be that there could be a conversation next week around arriving at some form of a quantifiable goal that could translate into your vision statement for the climate action plan. And by doing so, that would help to set you up for being able to tease out which are the fundamental strategies that you want to pursue developing the actions for implementation around, thinking about the funding options as well there. And those conversations then could happen towards the end of the month to arrive at a consensus around the strategies that could be put forward for this climate action plan, recognizing that the rest of your strategies would still be included in the climate action plan, but just under ones for a further refinement over the course of the next 4 years. And that's, we are really starting to think about it as like, what are the immediate strategies and ultimately the actions that you come up with that you feel like you could move and make significant progress on to advance whatever the goal is that you set over the course of 4 years. And so how we do that and how we think about that, we'll put more time into for that conversation over the course of the next few weeks. But that is the term that we're thinking about, recognizing that if you put everything forward too, it becomes, somewhat just so much that it's almost noise in what the highest priorities are for this bucket of work that you're trying to advance. And also recognizing that we have to come to consensus around those highest level strategies. As Lauren said, I really like that for the 3 pillars of what makes the climate action plan. And so recognizing that the most succinct suite of strategies that we know we can advance along with how we can fund those is going to be most important over the course of the next few weeks. I did drop in the chat that the way the milestones were presented to the Climate Council at the meeting on Monday has this subcommittee teed up to present on your actions for the end of September. So that would really mean that over the course of the month of September, once you've elevated the strategies, you'd have a month really to try to put ideas into action items, as well as start to think about the fundamental components of what we'll need, what the funding will look like, as well as other components of implementation around rulemaking and legislation. And so it's a really aggressive timeline. I also wanted to speak to the fact that we have been meeting with Just Transitions around the development of a facilitation contract to speak specifically to the scoring rubric and how you apply the scoring rubric. And our hope would be that that person would be on board by September to help funnel and facilitate conversations at the subcommittee level around specific actions that you're thinking about and how they sort of shake out through the scoring rubric to enhance and elevate the conversation with all of you, recognizing that there won't be enough time to have that conversation with all of your action items. And so that would intend to sort of train you all to then be able to use the scoring rubric on the rest of your actions, because that'll be really critical, as you all spoke to earlier, about when you present your actions, how you speak to what you thought about in putting the ones forward that you did. And equity and the scoring rubric and guiding principles will be key to that, as well as some of the other co-benefits that we've talked about, co-benefits of the strategy, technical feasibility, cost effectiveness, some of the other components. So David, go ahead.
Well, a question, Jane, like there seems to be, or not, maybe an observation and a question to see if how my thoughts coincide with what you're thinking in terms of what we need to produce but it feels to me like there has developed a fairly strong agreement, if not consensus. While we haven't tested it, I'm fairly confident we'll get the consensus on some significant foundational components of what our strategies should include. And that seems important to advance. And at the same time, the strategies that are much more detailed are going to be difficult to prioritize in the sense that they're a mix. Some are quite detailed, some are quite broad. Some require funding, some will require building new capacity, some will require changing the law. Some can be done now, and it's just a matter of pushing them up in a work plan. And the fact is that this is a huge and complex set of challenges. And my fear is that if we try to simplify too much through a prioritization process, that we lose the complexity. That a part of our messaging to the policymakers should be, there's a lot to do. Anyway, so my question is there a way that we can preserve and protect both, on the one level, the desire to have a set of foundational communications that we say, these are really important priorities for the following reasons, and also have these, in a sense, these task groups that I've been part of that put together work plans that I think are really, would be valuable products to be able to be part of a report, and will avoid us falling into what I, have seen that I think is a legitimate criticism of the main project, the main report, which is that it's so high a level that it doesn't really provide a roadmap.
Yeah, well, so I very much agree with that criticism, right? About the main climate action plan. It's very much the what and not the how. And I would argue that we're sort of at the same level of the main climate action plan right now with the body of work that we've all presented to the Climate Council. And so we're trying to get it down now to the next level of the how so that it's not lost and we have the action and implementation so we actually are able to move forward. I also recognize your concern that feels legitimate to me around how complex and how much really is needed in order to be successful in the climate space in the state and not wanting to lose that through prioritization. I also suggest that by having so much as like near-term goals and priorities that it just becomes too much to do. And so maybe the idea that the way we framed the climate action plan outline, and I ask this of all of you because Marian and I are spending some significant time over the last week and then next week together thinking about that original climate action plan outline and how it's going to move into templates and next stages of planning and inputs from all of you. We had bucketed it as short-term priorities and long-term priorities, but maybe that's too simplistic, right? Like it's not short-term priorities, it's not long-term priorities. It's nuanced in some way that allows us to take immediate action on a suite of sort of simpler strategies, as you say, that just we have to push the button on or just elevate. But there are going to be a lot of your strategies that require significant amounts of funding, right? Significant legwork and changes. And I do think with respect to those, we need to think about which ones we want to push, right? There's just only so much capacity right at the beginning. And so those, I don't want to lose the ones that just take simple switches and throw them down to the bottom because we wanted to move these bigger ideas. Maybe there's nuanced language in how we frame it in the climate action plan, ensuring that we elevate some of the larger issues that really need to start to take action on to move the train that take time, along with those simpler switches that we can also do. So thinking about how we frame it and hearing from you all on ideas about how to do that would really influence, I think, Marian and I's work to then communicate back out to you about how to prioritize your strategies. Charlie.
Thanks, Jean. You just kind of got at what I was going to kind of push on, and I think Lauren's comment gets at it exactly. But this idea that we've got long-term strategies that my concern is some of the long-term strategies are going to get pushed to the bottom but we're not going to be able to accomplish that short-term foundation setting that we need to achieve them. You know, one of them is like, if we have a 30 by 30 goal, we can't just all of a sudden in 2029 be like, hey, it's time to look at that, right? And so I'm wondering, as we look at our strategies, if there's a way that we can separate out kind of like the ends that we're looking to achieve, but keep the meat of the means to get there, so that as it goes up to the committee, they understand that, you know, the end is the strategy, or the end is the thing that we're elevating. But in order to achieve that, there's means that have to occur in the short term that can't be pushed to the bottom, or else we're never going to get to that final one. So I do think that's going to become a big issue as we look at prioritization.
Lauren?
Thanks, both co-chairs. So I'll just agree with the things that Charlie and David have said. And for part of what Jane said, which I put in the chat, that it might not be as easy as just long-term, short-term prioritization. There might be some nuance there. But I also do want to comment on the potential for there to be like an overwhelming number of strategies and or actions in the plan, and what we consider to be like implementable and what is just too much. And just recognize that this is intended to be a multi-stakeholder plan that's being created by all of us and all of the other subcommittees and the council at large, and that we should each have a pretty significant stake in implementing the plan as well, both within this process, since we're continuing long after we actually adopt the plan, but also with respect to our communities that we go back to as we leave these Zoom rooms. I think the plan right now might even be branded as Together Vermont. I hope that might still be on the table for this, okay. But just a recognition that Together Vermont was even thrown out as an idea. And I think that really, though I'm not necessarily a fan of the name, the idea behind it is right, that in order to comprehensively address climate change, it's going to take a lot more effort on all of our parts, you know, from the individual scale all the way up to this behemoth of a process that we're all in here. So I don't want to lose anything in the plan that might not be a priority or might not meet the capacity of like state government resources and needs, but that could theoretically be tackled by an NGO community or a community-based organization or something else somewhere in the state. So I just wanted to flag that as something that we should keep our eyes on too.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Lauren, and don't think I've ever tried to imply that it was a state plan only, and definitely think that there's different levels of implementation from all members of the Climate Council.
Yeah, I think, you know, we should also probably give some thought to like even the 4-year period pendency of the initial plan, or 4 or 5 years. And like, you know, there's stuff that they're going to be, you know, the legislature is going to want to act right in the coming biennium. So like, is there stuff you want to kind of tee up for this first session, first biennium, then stuff we want to tee up for the second biennium of that 4-year period? So I think that's another way we can think about being strategic, because I think the capacity that I'm concerned about is more like within the lawmaking space than anything else, because I think a lot of what we're talking about is going to require changes in legislation. And you know, our friends in the State House do excellent work. They have a lot on their plate. They've got a very deliberative process. So I think we just need to be mindful of how much we reasonably expect to get done in the first year, second year, third year of this plan from a legislative perspective. Other thoughts? So I do think it will be helpful to have Pat, who is our kind of professional facilitator, work us through the nuts and bolts of this next week of kind of how we establish that vision and goals, and how we come up with this kind of work plan to move these things forward in an appropriately prioritized or phased way. And I do think, and this was Lauren's suggestion to me some days ago, that, you know, starting with beginning to kind of consolidate and our different strategies and kind of get the overlap out and boil them down to kind of one list is probably a necessary first step. So it would be interested to hear your all thoughts about that. And if in Jane's perspective, and think if that's something we want to start even before we engage with Pat next week at the staff level.
Any thoughts from anybody as to how you want to start to, we want to start to collate the work? And or is it just that, you know, that's something that Billy and I need to try to do, to take all of the pieces from the different task groups and
My suggestion would be for there to be some of that work happening at the task lead level first. It really feels like rather than you taking the whole body of work, it's some conversation around, yeah. I want to give a little thought to this because I'm feeling sensitive to the term short-term, long-term, and do feel like there's probably a better way to capture that for you all to then take back to your task lead groups and think about how their strategies and ultimately if you've started to develop actions shake out. But let Marion and I give a little thought to the term short-term, long-term, and think about a better terminology there for you to then at a task lead level start to bucket where you're seeing your priorities fall. If that resonates with folks and makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think there's just an even kind of earlier task of just consolidating the lists, because I know each of the task groups in many ways there is some overlap in recommended strategies. So I think we need to give some thought to that. So maybe that's something that Abby and I can just kind of begin to think through in a very coarse way. And then, yeah, get that guidance from you, Jane, before we meet with the task leads to really dig into that work.
I also think it'll be helpful that I think your point's a good one, because at the task group level, we can also have our spreadsheets and lists in front of us. In some ways, having some more specific examples to kind of play with as we plug them into different categories will be a more useful exercise than doing it in the abstract.
Yeah. Good. Well, we're actually at time for this agenda item. Up went quickly. But this is obviously an important conversation. This is really the real work now of how we move this forward in a way that is effective and achieves our goals and our vision. So any other comments folks want to hit on right now? Otherwise, we'll dedicate a good amount of next week's meeting to this work with Pat.
Just want to elevate Charlie's. So he says, regarding implementation, can the climate action plan framework designate specific tasks to non-state entities, either nonprofit sector or creation of task groups within direction, or is this designed to land within agencies, et cetera?
I think it very much can, Charlie. I mean, that's what Lauren was referencing back after her comment too, that, that we very intentionally set this up at the beginning as you were framing your work in those spreadsheets to identify the key implementer, because it won't always be the state, it'll be at different levels.
Plenty of work to go around. Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I think, as I said, we'll get more into this next week, but this is starting of kind of the next phase of our work, which is exciting. And yeah, I'd ask all of you to just give some thought to, is there a vision or an articulatable goal that you think is appropriate for this subcommittee, and that could create some directional clarity for our strategies and recommendations. So I think, we don't need to discuss that now. We're not going to, but we probably will get into that a little bit with Pat next week. And so let that kind of spin in the back of your brains. All right. Unless I hear otherwise, folks ready to move on? Okay, excellent. So the next piece of our agenda is a conversation around stakeholder engagement, audience, and kind of brainstorming. And Jane, I think you're going to lead this up. I think you sent some materials out late yesterday, perhaps in advance of this. So I'll pass it on to you.
I'm not sure I did, but I sent out the public engagement plan yesterday. I did, for everybody's reference, I did send out the public engagement plan to you all at the end of the day yesterday. It's in its PDF form, and there's also included in the email a survey monkey intended for Climate Council members and subcommittee members to articulate any comments and or feedback that you have on the public engagement plan. You may notice what we tried to do very intentionally after some significant conversation back and forth with our public engagement consultants was we tried to frame the nucleus, the center of our public engagement around these 7 statewide events that they will conduct in September. That is what I spoke to earlier when I said that they're building the collateral and tools needed for those events now, informed by your presentations from Monday. Those events, 3 of them will be online and 4 of them will be in person. And we're starting to think about those agendas in concert with the Just Transition Subcommittee meeting. At their next meeting, we're going to focus in on this, as well as building toolkits for those materials. So that you'll notice also in the public engagement plan, the other components of engagement speak to stakeholder engagement, as well as any additive engagement that we all want to do through your networks or through additional events that come to us through the public or our standing events where we see that we could have, we can amplify our message. And so Climate Access and RISE are speaking specifically to development of not only the presentation, but also a facilitation guide, as well as feedback forms, so that if there's a NOFA farming event that we could be on site and deliver some messaging, we can try to think about how we can fit those into the schedule too. But specifically over the next month to 6 weeks, we're thinking a lot about stakeholder engagement. And this has been intentional already with the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, largely because there was a timeline for public engagement and specifically stakeholder engagement that was driven by the Public Service Department, recognizing that they're also developing the comprehensive energy plan, and 3 of the 4 sectors in cross-sector overlap very much with the comprehensive energy plan. So we already, for the month of August, have stakeholder engagement set up for transportation, electricity, and buildings and thermal that will be co-led by Climate Council members as well as the Public Service Department. In recognition that the events that we're holding in September are at a higher level, they're really about the why should Vermont care, as well as starting to test some of the higher level pathways, but aren't going to get into the specifics of your strategies and ideas. We wanted to start to reach out to specifically ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, and recognize that you also have a constituent group that you likely will want to reach out specifically for, that will feel the impacts of your proposals more directly, as well as likely have great ideas that you would want to contribute, add into your work.
Sorry.
And so,
To talk to you.
so I think it's Alyssa, I think you're unmuted. So, and so I was hoping that we could start to have this conversation with you all, recognizing that Consensus Building Institute, our facilitator, not Climate Access and RISE, will lead the stakeholder engagement on behalf of ag and ecosystems and rural resilience. And so the intent would be that if we could narrow down some key stakeholder groups that you all would like to think about meetings with, that we could work with the co-chairs to pull together some work between now and your next meeting, and think about how we set those up and work with CBI to drive those meetings. So yeah, that's my overview of this component. And I also recognize that the stakeholder engagement will be really critical because unlike the work that Climate Access and RISE is doing, where we won't have their synopsis of the events in September until October, we're hoping that CBI will be able to provide meaningful summaries and synopsis from these stakeholder events within a week of holding them. So you can get that feedback quickly and intentionally fold it into your action development.
I don't know where this concern fits in this, but it's my impression that Climate Access has already conducted some interviews, and I'm wondering, is all of the data and information that they're collecting, we have to wait until September?
That's in the plan that came out yesterday that I shared with you.
Okay.
So all of the
apologize.
information they did for the interviews and stakeholder engagement, and sorry, not roundtables to date, that synopsis is in the public engagement plan, but was really intended to direct how we engage with the Vermont public. They didn't test or really speak to climate change and the impacts of climate change, the Climate Council, what we're doing. It was really a conversation about if and when we do public engagement around issues related to climate change, how would you want us to engage you? And so it was really a question about how to engage with different constituents and stakeholder groups. And therefore, they built the public engagement plan around meeting the concerns and questions that those folks had around how they wanted us to talk to them about this work. So now those people are intended to then, you'll see in the public engagement plan, we also have funding to lift up partners and others in this space to help us amplify our message. So some of the folks who they spoke to said, we'd love to help you reach these constituents because there are constituents. And rather than you trying to go out and break the ground with them, why don't you come back to us and we'll do it for you? And we actually have money in our contract with Climate Access and RISE to pay partners to help us with that. And that's part of the public engagement plan that you'll see that I shared with you last night. So this isn't, and I just wanted to respond also about the stakeholder feedback that you guys already gave us. And that is in the plan. So that synopsis of all the stakeholders that you all spoke to is in the plan. To me, that what I'm hoping to get out of this isn't like a laundry list of stakeholders from all of you, but like a themed area that you would want to invite those stakeholders in to discuss. So you might want to consider an agricultural themed stakeholder event. And then we would look at all the stakeholders you already identified to come up with an invite list, but you might want to specifically test your emissions reductions as well as your sequestration strategies with a core suite of the agricultural community. You may also want to have a core suite of stakeholder engagement on natural lands solutions. And therefore you would have a targeted group of stakeholders drawn upon from that list that you invite in. I don't imagine, so I'm thinking of it more as sectors, the way that we think about in cross-sector, who those key groups are, and then we would work with you to get the right people in. And it wouldn't be more than 2 or 3, because that's probably about what is right with your work, as well as really what we have capacity to pull off between now and September.
So can I just jump in here for a second? So you're asking a few things of us. First, review the plan that you sent out and provide comments through the Survey Monkey. That's one task. The other task is for us to identify kind of sector-ish groups that we can use as umbrellas to do direct outreach to stakeholders through CBI. And when do you want us to do that? And what's the kind of mechanism to do that?
Yeah, well, I actually thought we were going to do it right now in a conversation.
Oh, okay. Well,
but if we don't feel like we can do that because of time constraints, then people can we can come up with a different process.
we've got a little bit of, we're at the end of this time, but we do have some unstructured time at the end of the meeting that we can borrow from. So, as long as Liz doesn't mind hanging on a few extra minutes. So Jane, so let's spend 5 more minutes on this. And if we can't knock it out, then we'll do it next time. But it sounds like you're thinking 3. So you're thinking like forestry, agriculture, something else.
Doesn't have to be 3, it could be 2, if you could theme them differently.
Like you said, Jen, you could do a natural working, not natural resource, natural lands segment.
Mhm.
And this would be like a facilitated conversation that stakeholders will be invited to provide feedback on the specific strategies and recommendations and pathways that we're developing.
Yes.
Okay. And we would have time to kind of figure out who the invitees would be to that. Okay.
I would imagine that the task groups that each of the themed stakeholder events overlaps with, we would tap into them to think about who the invite list is, who the speaker, how we would facilitate the speaker event, so on and so on. The agenda planning for that has been, for cross-sector, has been the task leads of each of the sector that we're doing, with supported by public service department staff. David, go ahead.
Well, just on the substantive note, I mean, it seems that those seem like exactly the right 3 categories. And it seems that particularly for the 2 working lands pieces, the forest and ag, that having, there's of course the environmental community, but then there's the actual folks within each of those sectors. And one of the challenges for both of those sectors is that they're full of smaller, effectively business people that represent a range of different types of farming or different pieces and components of forestry. From, for instance, it's really challenging to figure out how to get loggers, the perspective of loggers, because the loggers right now are all pretty darn busy and don't have a lot of capacity to be involved in it. But we need someone in the conversation that reflects some of those perspectives. So I don't necessarily have like the right lists in mind, but I think that but collectively within this group, we can probably come up with a mix of folks that reflect both the advocates that are operating around some of the nonprofit community components, but also some of the private sector components. And then there's, of course, local governments.
That's helpful, thank you.
So within those kind of 2 to 3 overarching categories, are those expansive and inclusive enough to get the range of stakeholders we think are necessary to weigh in, or are we missing something, or should we be more explicit in any of those categories?
I think I'm feeling like the broad categories are okay. I guess the thing that I'm struggling with is that I understand the tactic on very specific, concentrated stakeholder groups and outreach. I guess as a counselor, what I'm feeling like I'm missing is that I think that the information gathered from, or I'm kind of interested in knowing what all of the subcommittees are generating as their stakeholder groups, and who is being asked, who are we asking in other ways, and where do those intersect? I'm just worried we're headed into another siloed moment, or I don't want to just be thinking only about the ways that impacts of our policy decisions are landing on these specific sectors. I want to also have an idea of what people in other sectors are thinking too, because at the end of the day, these are all, climate interconnects everything. So I don't know. Maybe this isn't the time or place for that. That's just something I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I do think that the 7 events, and hopefully you'll look at the plan, are intended to get at the interconnected nature of the ideas coming out of all of the subcommittees and intended to then roll into the climate action plan. I just think that it's at a higher level than perhaps would drill down to like specific technical, like the way I've heard cross-sector speak to it. And like, I really like this analogy is like, you should do this, not because you need engagement, but you should around these things, but you should do it because there's a real benefit in reaching out to these core groups to sort of geek. That's what this component is, to sort of geek out on the strategies and actions, because these folks have some really important ideas to feed into the development, and we haven't gone broad enough in the spaces that we're speaking to get that yet. So it's really, this is if you need technical feedback, not engagement. Like it's really about technical. I mean, and they're one and the same. So I don't mean to say not engagement, but this is really around technical feedback on your work. Charlie.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the key that rises in my mind is the implementation end of it. And if we're going to be putting forward recommendations that are going to have to be implemented by, like in my silo, foresters, landowners, loggers, we're going to want foresters, landowners, and loggers in the room to tell us that makes sense, or you're an idiot, that'll never work, or something in between, right? So yeah, I think this is a good way of thinking about it. And I'd say that reaching out to kind of starting kind of at a coarse filter with kind of industry or landowner associations like VWA or Forest Products Association, or those groups, and kind of pulling from the leadership of those groups might be a great place to start, since they tend to be a little bit more active. I mean, as I think David pointed out, like it's hard to get loggers in a room any time of year. So yeah, and I also wanted to just flag, Ali had a great comment about land use planning, and pulling in regional planning commissions might be another interesting one, because they're doing a lot of work in the communities now around how to implement smart growth or Act 171 or things like that. So they could have a lot of group feedback specifically around capacity. One of the things we're going to have to do is really beef up capacity for regional planning commissions, because that is very, very diverse. I have people I'm working with over on this side, and Northwest is great, but NVDA doesn't have the capacity. So I think we need to hear from them too.
Awesome. Thanks, Charlie. Lauren.
I just want to be sure when we say agriculture, I don't know, and I guess I would lean on Abby as the expert in the room on that, that we also make sure that we're including, if not in that space, then a space for the actual food systems, food network, food insecurity piece of this. Like, I don't know if Hunger Free Vermont or Vermont Food Bank or any other like CBO would be involved, but I would think they would be pretty critical to this process, and just make sure that if there isn't a space for them at that ag roundtable, that we either create a new roundtable for just them, or try our best to actually incorporate them with the ag team.
I don't have much to add to that, just that I think that's a great point, and I'll keep thinking about it.
Alyssa.
Hi, everybody. I apologize for not being on screen in the beginning. I was on the road this morning, and I just wanted to add, in terms of including the food system leaders and the folks that have really been working on some of these issues for a long time in the food systems world. If Jake was here, I wonder if he might suggest that we pitch a session at the Farm to Plate event. It's in November, but it still could be a really great place to facilitate conversation with lots of leaders and thinkers about that. And I know it's kind of beyond the timeline that Jane mentioned, but it seems like potentially folks from the task leads, maybe from this committee, might be it'd be great to bring it to that event where the conversation is happening.
So in the that's a great idea, and there's a number of things like that that have been suggested to us, and you'll see in the public engagement plan a start at a calendar to pull ideas like that into, recognizing that there'll be a lot of events like that that are really great for us to plug into. And that's very much the intent of the public engagement plan, is to identify those and then bring capacity to have folks go to those, and hopefully to empower council members and subcommittees members to do that on behalf of the council work. And that's the intent of putting together the collateral and a facilitation guide and a feedback form, so we can also hear from those people and use that information in a consistent way.
Great. So Jane, do you think you've got enough to work with at this point on this topic?
Yeah, I feel like I need someone to say exactly the 3 buckets again, because I've heard a few different terms thrown around. So I had agriculture, but I also had working lands, and I wasn't sure if when we were talking about working lands, we were trying to get at forestry and ag together, and then sort of more of a natural, keep it separate.
I would split that out, definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's
and then-
probably like ag and food systems, forestry and forest processing, and then natural lands and land use, maybe.
Okay, but I'll keep it at that for now. We can refine that if that feels right for folks.
Great. And then we'll have an opportunity as a group to kind of reflect on those and recommend stakeholders for all of them going forward, right, Jane?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Great. So this isn't our last shot at this conversation, folks. Okay. I think in the interest of time, I would like to move on if everyone else is good with that. Okay. Super. So now we're moving on to something very different and exciting. We've got some folks here from the technical team that is contracted to support the work of the Climate Council on a number of different tasks, one of which is developing a carbon budget for the state. We have a task group within our subcommittee that is focused on the carbon budget, and we are going to meet with the consulting team in early August to have a more kind of focused and technical conversation around the methodology and the development of that budget. But today we thought it was important to provide the whole subcommittee and the public an overview of the what and why behind the carbon budget, and some context of what it is, what it isn't, how it's being developed, and how we anticipate it being used as we move forward in developing this plan and future plans. So happy to have Liz and Gillian here today Jillian, excuse me, here to present to us. So why don't I hand it over to the two of you? And we have, I think, about 40-45 minutes, so use as much or little as time as you like for that, and we can always fill in. We'll burn up the time you don't use easily. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Billy and Abby and Jane, for including us. I've had the good fortune of joining a number of these subcommittee calls, and I'm always really impressed by the conversations you guys are having. So glad to be included, and again, really impressed by all the good work you're doing. So my name is Liz Hansen. I'm a senior associate at CADMIS, which is a sort of sustainability and clean energy consulting firm that has the pleasure of working with the Vermont Climate Council on the technical services scope of the work that you're doing. My background is in state and local government, and at CADMIS, I focus on working mostly with states, regions, and cities that are focusing on decarbonization. And for this, I'm the CADMIS project director. I'm co-leading with a colleague from Energy Futures Group, David Hill. Next slide, if you would, Jillian. Sorry, that didn't get updated. So we'll skip over that. But our agenda for today is to go over the technical analysis overview. I'll just quickly talk about our full scope of work, so you have a sense of where the piece that Jillian is talking about fits into the work that we're doing, as well as other points along the process that you might see us pop up here again. And then Jillian will go into much more detail on the carbon budget specifically. So our work consists of 5 main tasks: project management, which we're in constant communication with Jane, and then some preliminary tasks. So task 1, reviewing the current greenhouse gas emissions inventory; task 2, developing the carbon budget; and then I would say the first half of task 3, which is looking at the social cost of carbon model that Vermont has developed. those are, I would call, sort of more foundational efforts of reviewing the work that you all have done already, making sure that sort of the processes that you have in place align with the goals of the GWSA, and sort of providing recommendations based on best practices that are out there that others have been working on or that are recommended, to make sure that you have all the right tools in your toolbox to write the first cap and start implementing the actions that you're looking to implement, to sort of track those impacts and make sure that you're right sizing what you think those impacts will be. Jillian may talk a little bit more about sort of the relationship between the current greenhouse gas inventory and the carbon budget, but those obviously are working in close coordination together, as they're very much complementary tools, sort of different looks at similar things. One obviously looking at the broader picture of both sequestration and mitigation, and so we can get into that, and if you have questions, happy to address those. The latter part of our work in these tasks here are really helping alongside you as you're working on that pathway process that you all were just talking about. So working with the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee in particular to take the pathways, strategies, and actions that you all will be identifying and refining, putting them into a tool called LEAP, which basically is a greenhouse gas accounting tool. So it balances energy supply and energy demand and sort of tells us the overall picture of how the emissions will come down over time, helps us link with another tool called InPlan that takes the cost information out of LEAP and applies it to sort of the larger Vermont economy. So hopefully giving you, again, additional input and resources and things to chew on as you finalize the cap this winter. And then helping with a tracking tool. Next slide, Jillian. So there's sort of 3 accelerated phases of our work. Like I said, those first tasks we prioritize in that June to July timeframe to get those up and running so that you have that foundational information. We're almost at the end of July, which is crazy. And so we are nearing completion on the draft greenhouse gas inventory report that will be shared with stakeholders. And as Jane mentioned, there will be a presentation on Wednesday to the Science and Data Subcommittee on that, with some final work to be wrapped up in August. And then similarly with the carbon budget, as Billy mentioned, Jillian will be working with your task force to review the recommendations for the methodology and the data sources, and then we'll continue on working on that final report for the end of September. August and September will largely be focused on those pathways analysis and the economic analysis. So accelerated timeline, just like yours, trying to help alongside you as you build those up. And that's it for me. So if there are questions sort of about our scope of work or anything else, I'm happy to field them now before I turn it over to Jillian. I don't see any, so I think I'll go ahead and turn you over to the main event, which I'm sure you're more excited to hear about than tasks and phases.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today and talk to you specifically about this carbon budget. I want to acknowledge the full team that's been contributing to this work. So I'm Jillian Galford at the University of Vermont. I work in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Another key participant is Dr. Heather Darby, which if you work in agriculture in Vermont, I think you probably know Heather. She is both an extension professor and a professor in plant and soil science at UVM, as well as a farmer in Aalborg. Frederick Hall is a student, master's student in our complex system and data science program, who has helped me with some of the technical aspects of this. And Dr. Ali Kasiba, a state employee who's, I think, here today. Lucky us because it's raining really hard, so they can go out in the field, is also contributed to this work, particularly on the forest side of things, which is her expertise, of course. So what is the point of the carbon budget? I think there's a lot of terms and a lot of jargon, shorthand notes that we're using to differentiate these different tasks. So this language really comes from the RFP put out by the state. But what's specified within the carbon budget is that this is really focused on greenhouse gas emissions or activities that sequester carbon in natural and working lands. So one of the goals of our particular work is to add more management components to the assessment of natural and working lands. The current tool used by the state to inventory greenhouse gas emissions does include agriculture, but it's very limited in terms of the scope of agricultural practices that are considered. For example, it primarily considers emissions from livestock, but it doesn't consider some of the beneficial practices like the use of cover crops that can actually build carbon on the landscape instead of releasing it to the atmosphere. So that's part of our approach here, is to really add some more nuance to the carbon dynamics, to our understanding of the carbon dynamics in Vermont's natural and working lands. So this hopefully provides some really foundational knowledge for you all and for the Climate Council, and may elucidate some areas where we have more leverage or more potential to either reduce emissions or increase sequestration in desirable ways. So an important sort of foundational step. The table on the left comes directly from the state's RFP. So this is what this task is meant to cover: stocks of carbon, as well as fluxes. So on the right are sort of my notes in terms of what this really means. So the overall goal is establishing the current status of carbon stocks and fluxes. We are trying to look back in time to 1990. With the available data as best we can. Not all data has continuity back to 1990. So we're doing the best we can on kind of the historical reconstruction there. As I said, this focuses on natural and working landscapes. Sometimes we use the term agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So I want to throw both those terms out there so we're on the same page. And the interesting, to me, the intellectually interesting part is that forest and agriculture tend to be very heavily influenced by human management decisions on the ground, but it can be really hard to get data or insight into exactly what human management activities are going on. So that's definitely a big challenge on this task. And just to make sure we're using the same terms, when I refer to a stock, we're talking about carbon that is stored in the system. So how much carbon is there in the forest? How much money do you have in your bank? That would be your stock of carbon. Flux is the carbon moving in or out of the system, particularly over a period of time. So usually we think about annual fluxes. So how much carbon does the forest take up in a year? And for reference, we're using the nomenclature of positive fluxes, mean it's land use is a net source to the atmosphere, so it's releasing carbon to the atmosphere. And when we note something as a negative flux, it means it's a sink from the atmosphere. That is, it's pulling carbon from the atmosphere into that land use. So our analysis uses the exact tool. It's fairly similar conceptually to the state's approach with the SIT tool developed by the EPA. Again, the primary differences are what type of management activities it considers. And exact is really specifically designed for more of a focus on agriculture and more of a focus on management of working lands, including grasslands and other sort of integrated management with agriculture. So it gives us a lot more nuance, particularly in the agriculture and land use sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit about crops and livestock and so on. Here we go. So in terms of data, our approach has been to use 2017 data, primarily from the USDA census and from state of Vermont reports. This makes our numbers the most comparable as possible to Vermont's 2017 inventory, which is our most recent inventory on hand. In some cases, there is not published data. There isn't a report, there isn't a database on certain agricultural management practices. And so we've had to rely on primary knowledge. And in some cases, that is the input of someone like Heather Darby. Heather, for reference, has reviewed something like 80% of the state's nutrient management plans for farms. So she knows a lot about what all types of farmers are doing. And we've also consulted with other colleagues. So in some cases, we don't know exactly what, or there is no published data on record for the percent of dairy farms that spread manure on their hay fields. But Heather, again, has reviewed that from the nutrient management plans for every farm and knows roughly the breakdown of those farms that use that practice and don't. So we've had to rely on some expert knowledge like that because there just isn't data on all of these management practices. So I'm going to start with forests. Ali is here, so if we have questions, we'll hold them to the end and she can answer them later. But I like to talk about forests by thinking about yourself, maybe taking a moment, take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. We are breathing in oxygen and we breathe out CO2, but our forests act in opposite, right? They bring in CO2 and breathe out the oxygen that we rely on. And so forests over time, as they grow, are building carbon in their biomass. They're turning it into their cells. So the amount of forest area in Vermont is the most important factor in terms of how much carbon is stored in our forested landscapes. If you guys haven't seen it already, I want you to, maybe Ali, you can even put it in the chat, take a look at the forest carbon inventory. This is a report that Dr. Kosiba did this year. And it really, it does the full stocks and fluxes analysis for Vermont's forests based on a lot of really great recent data. This figure is pointing out sort of the troubling trend of forest loss. So that means if we're losing area in forest over time, we may be losing we will be losing carbon stock stored in that forested landscape. And so within the forest, we tend to think of carbon stored in a few different buckets or categories. So there's the forests themselves, but then there's things like harvested wood products. So harvested wood products could be the furniture that we have in our offices. It could also be items that are sitting in a landfill. But these are all places that carbon are stored in. And so in this report, Ali goes into detail on that. But over 1.7 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent is stored in these forested categories. Within forests, we also think about subcategories. So what part of the forest is storing carbon? So there's 5 primary pools, and these are shown in this slide, but the living biomass, the soils, dead wood, litter, and so on. Soils, I want to point out, are a really huge reservoir for carbon. So they are holding a lot of carbon. They are storing a lot of our carbon. And this is important when we then start to consider the fluxes of carbon. So again, when we have a negative flux, which we do have a negative flux of carbon, it means that our forests are taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than they're releasing into the atmosphere. But you'll see this time, it's not forests that are doing the heavy work. It's actually the growth in biomass or the accumulation of vegetation in our forests that is taking in that carbon. So just to note that there are fluxes out of the forest as forests decompose or we combust biomass, but the net result is that our forests are taking up much more carbon than we're releasing. Okay, I'm gonna kind of step through agriculture in the same way. So agriculture also can be a net flux to the atmosphere, a source, or a sink. It can actually, certain agricultural activities can increase storage of carbon on the landscape. In Exact, the approach we're using here, we primarily consider fluxes from livestock and fluxes from cropland. For the most part, livestock and manure management, so things like where the manure goes on a particular farm, the way it's treated on a particular farm, determines the magnitude or the amount of flux to the atmosphere, but largely these categories are positive. That is their source of carbon to the atmosphere. Within croplands, we consider the type of crops being grown, their yield, use of fertilizers, management of manure, so additions of manure to the landscape, and practices like tillage, as well as other inputs like cover crops. So depending on the mix of particular activities within the croplands, croplands can be either positive or a negative contribution to the carbon flux. So we find a net flux of about 500,000 metric tons per year. This is our preliminary analysis, again, for based on 2017 data. But in our full report, we will go through all these different practices, probably in more detail than people want to know. But in terms of understanding which practices seem to be a positive, a source, or a sink. And I think that's important because these activities that help us increase our sink are ones we might want to find ways to increase in terms of their adoption or uptake, whether it's in forestry or if it's in agriculture and working lands. So some takeaways: we have this huge carbon stock and sink from our forests. They're just out there constantly helping us manage our carbon, but are certainly under threat if we lose substantial area of forest. Agricultural management practices definitely make a difference in the magnitude of our agricultural fluxes and can even reverse the direction within those numbers. So some of our next steps is to go, as has been mentioned several times, our group will be meeting with the technical task force from this subcommittee to review some of the technical details. So this is going to be really helpful to us in sort of finalizing our estimates and making sure we're answering the questions the way you all want them answered. We're also working to reconstruct the exact estimates back to 1990, again, facing some limitations in data that may prohibit the full budget back to 1990, but the goal is 1990 to present. And we'll be following up with additional meetings throughout August and September. So I believe that leaves us with some time for discussion. I want to thank you guys for your attention today. I'm going to stop sharing if that's better for discussion, but let me know if there's a particular slide you want to go back to.
Super. Thank you very much.
David's
for that.
hand go right up.
Yeah, David, go for it.
Thanks. I have two distinct questions. One for Jillian, for sure, and maybe one for the Ag Task Group folks at AFM. But the first question relates to wetlands. There's been some discussion, particularly in the ag community in Vermont, about whether wetlands are positive or negative flux. And I think folks are confusing some of the national global confusion around peat bogs and some of the larger questions about the role of wetlands writ large. And so I'm hoping that this report and your work will be specific to Vermont and put to rest that question, which from my perspective, it seems pretty clear that they're a negative flux and a benefit. And then the second question, just to get it out there, is much more mundane, but the work on the Ag Task Group has been drawing on a set of information that Judson Peck has very carefully and patiently compiled that has informed our recommendations in terms of which ag practices have the greatest potential for improving carbon storage. And it seems important to make sure that the information that we've used is aligned and coordinated with the work that your group is doing. So I'm hoping that there's some cross fertilization or pollination happening there. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Just to your second question, Ryan Patch is on the carbon budget task group, and I think Judson is helping from a technical staffing perspective. So we've got some good overlap there.
I'm just curious, Jillian and Liz, as we're thinking about recommendations for the future coming out of this work. And I think you mentioned that some of what is really difficult is that the human management decisions aren't collected anywhere. Was that, did I take that away correctly? That there's
Some
no,
are and some aren't.
so there, so
To what degree of detail? Yeah.
is that something that, you know, from a technical research and development standpoint, you know, would behoove us as a state to make sure that we're trying to better encapsulate those data so that we have them moving forward to accurately understand the full picture of what is happening in the agricultural sector and in that land base? Because if so, I think that's something we can add into, you know, as an action item or a strategy item, as, you know, how we're moving things forward.
Yeah, so we're both trying to document our methods and how we came up with estimates in various categories. So having methodologies that could be repeated with the data that is available. But I think also our report will include some discussion of data limitations. I'm hesitant to say how those data gaps should be filled. Abby, you're a farmer. You know, there's already a lot of burden on you in terms of reporting and such. So I think I would leave it to more qualified experts to say how those data gaps got filled, but we can certainly identify what they are and ideally what type of data would be tracked or available one way or another.
I will say that yes, I think that is a great framing of it. And I think it would be helpful for those of us who are engaging in that sector to sort of know from your standpoint what's missing. And then maybe we can do some thinking about how, I mean, farmers don't like to give up their information. So, you know, the strategic play behind how to appropriately go about helping us all better understand what's actually happening in the field. Thank you.
Judy, go ahead, please.
I have a question. When you talk about how much carbon is in the bank, are you including the Green Mountain National Forest? Because that's 76% of forest land in Vermont, and we don't have control over that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm actually going to turn it over to Allie, who's the most familiar with those. And I see there's another question, and I think I can answer them, but I think Allie's going to give you a more nuanced answer than I would. So go ahead.
Yeah, Green Mountain National Forest is the largest landholder. It's not 76%. I think it's about, I want to say 20%. I have to get those numbers. But yes, the values I included, there was a question in the chat. Does it cover all types of forests? It covers all of our forests. It's from, the data come from the US Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, which is a nationwide program that has a very statistically robust way to lay down permanent plots that the actual location is private. I can't even get the location of those plots. It's really protected. And they cover private land, public land, all land types, including those that are harvested. So that's how we get estimates of harvest, land use change, all sorts of growth and yield across all ages and types of forests.
I can just respond a little bit. Judy, I know you've been consistently raising questions about how the National Forest manages their land, and that we appreciate that. So Bob Pop on our team had to help us understand that, reached out to the National Forest. They're going to be sending their most recently updated management plan to us. So we've got that information to look at. And I think they're going to identify kind of a point person on their team that we can have access to get additional information about how they do what they do on our land, and opportunities for our recommendations to kind of influence outcomes on the National Forest in Vermont.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you.
So, but to answer my question, Allie, when you talk about how much we have in the bank, you're including that forest?
Yes, it's an estimate for all Vermont forests within our state boundaries. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for the team right now? And you know, my internet skipped out a little bit in the early part of the presentation, so this might have been covered, but just want to make sure we're clear that the carbon budget it's not quite a baseline, but it's really kind of looking at how we've gotten to where we're at now in Vermont and traditional activities related to carbon emissions and sequestration. It's not going to be the tool that we use necessarily to model future scenarios based on strategies and action items, but it will help inform that work, is my sense. So that's just an important distinction also. Jane?
I did just want to mention that we've also had conversations with Jillian and Liz, as well as Harvard ecologists, around the idea of putting together additional work that would complement the carbon budget, looking at future projections. So in a way similar to emissions, and you guys should check me if I get this wrong, but in a way thinking about the way we look at emissions as a business as usual, we would actually also think about our sequestration potential and think about what it would look like over time if we stayed the course of the policies and practices that are in place consistently, and thinking about how we model our sequestration value over time with different ideas and policy levers. And so my understanding is that Jonathan, who we've been working with at Harvard, is putting together a scope of work for us to consider. And that won't be done for this climate action plan, but it would be future work that we could point to in this climate action plan to inform other future strategies and ideas.
Great. Okay. Anything else on this? I think we do have a task group meeting kind of in early mid-August with the technical team to dive into this at a deeper level. So this is a great preface to that conversation and an opportunity for the full subcommittee and public to kind of hear more about this. So thank you both for spending some time with us this morning. Anything else on this topic before we move on? Okay.
I just want to say a specific thank you. I really appreciate the nuanced way in which you're approaching this. I think that's going to be really beneficial to these sectors, particularly to have a more nuanced understanding of the way in which these actions are happening. So thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just add, unfortunately, John Roberts, who is another member of subcommittee who has deep technical experience working with the agricultural sector, couldn't be here today. He had some family obligations, but he's indicated he's eagerly looking forward to watching the video of this, and I'm sure he'll follow up with any questions or suggestions that we can kind of pass on to the team afterwards. Okay, well, thanks again. Let me just check our agenda here. Well, we're actually back on schedule. The only items we have left is, we've budgeted about 15 minutes for some unstructured group chat if we've got topics. Otherwise, we can go on to kind of firming up our agenda and any tasks in advance of our meeting next Friday, and then have some time for public comment. So don't know if anyone has any kind of general discussion topics they want to raise based on anything we talked about earlier or otherwise. Now's the time. Anybody? Okay. Oh, David. Thank you. Go ahead.
I've been thinking about, since Jane talked about the public engagement strategy, I've been just thinking about that. And I mean, it's an amazing plan. I just glanced through it, and an incredible opportunity. And to have paid consultants that can help facilitate and lead those discussions is really a rare opportunity. And I wonder if we shouldn't spend a little more time, if we've got the time, to just think out loud a little bit about the logistics of how we, as a group, help support that effort you know, in some of our groups, like my group, I can help do some advertising and publicizing of opportunities. We also have relationships of people we know that we could try to encourage and say, hey, you know, I know like everyone's meeting out. Nobody wants to go to one more thing, but this is like a really critical moment. Like this is a chance to really help leverage some bigger changes. Anyway, so I'm just, that's all, I know that's not a very concrete suggestion, but it's all spinning about in my head.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have some time. So I think, you know, Jane, if you think that would be helpful to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that conversation, I think that is a good suggestion. And Charlie, I don't know if you're on that same thread or if you have something separate, so feel free to share your thinking.
Yeah, I just in line with what David was saying, and I know that scheduling is difficult and everyone's busy, but I think it would be really great and almost really necessary at these events to have someone from the committee that worked in these areas there, because it's great to have a paid consultant to lead them, but a lot of the stuff that we've come up with, especially how it gets condensed, can be interpreted in different ways, or it can kind of bring up questions around like, what did you mean by this? Or how would that work in this situation? So I'd really encourage as we schedule these to try to do it so that somebody, one or two people from task groups or the committee can be there to help kind of guide the discussion from like a conversational way instead of just a here's the thing, respond to it, okay, thanks, let's move on perspective. So thanks.
Before we go to Lauren, so Jane, you're just asking a clarifying question from Charlie. You're talking in reference to these kind of 3-ish sector stakeholder meetings that we're talking about coordinating. Okay.
Yeah, for the, well, I mean, it'd be great to have someone there for all of them, but specifically for the sector specific ones where we want to kind of dig in a little bit more detail into some specific focal areas, it would be, I think it's going to be critical that there's someone there that can kind of guide more of a conversation than just kind of a, here's the thing, let's give me the feedback, and then we'll kind of keep going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that.
And so maybe just some clarity around that. 100% those would be led by you all. As they are being led by cross-sector in the other spaces. So the task lead and supported by professionals like CBI to do the facilitation, note-taking, and summaries. But yeah, with the expectation would be that the appropriate subcommittee reps for each of the topics we discussed would lead that conversation.
More than you asked for, Charlie, but there it is. Lauren.
I think I have to change my comment now based on Jane's response to Charlie. Charlie, I raised that same question, but maybe more from a full council perspective, not necessarily subcommittee, when the draft plan wasn't presented to us yet, but Jane was kind of telling us when it was coming out and what would be included in it. And I raised a similar concern about like, will counselors be able to be part of any of these stakeholder events? And it seemed like, and Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I'm really, really happy to hear this. So thanks for moving that in such a way that some of the subcommittee members can be present. But I thought that I heard from Climate Access that though there could be an opportunity for counselors to be present, they didn't want to overwhelm any of the audiences by having counselors present, or at least not too many. So I just wonder if that has since changed their thought on that.
So I guess I just want to, I think there is a little confusion because originally Climate Access and RISE were calling their events in September stakeholder events. And so I'm trying really hard to like call those the statewide public engagement events. And then there's like the stakeholder events around more technical questions that'll happen, not led by Climate Access and RISE, but led by subcommittee council members that will be supported by CBI, not even supported by Climate Access and RISE. And so what Climate Access and RISE did respond to you, Lauren, in your comment when they presented the stakeholder engagement plan was totally concerning to all of us. And I think that it should be reflected in the public engagement plan that those are public open events and that the council members, subcommittee members are encouraged to come. And the nuance I think that they were trying to make when they were speaking to it is that they don't view those as talking head events where like council members and folks and our staff get up and talk about like what the ideas are, but they're really listening events to invite Vermonters in and hear from them. But except for one, which they intend to be in a BIPOC infinity space, all of them will be open to the public, and council members and subcommittee members are welcome to attend.
Thanks, Jane.
Okay, so I think going back to David's kind of original point, so we're thinking about these kind of roughly 3 stakeholder technical conversations. So there's that piece, and I think we'll need to do some work about who is invited under, they'll be open. I'm assuming they're going to be open to the public, but we'll probably want to do some outreach and make sure that certain people are aware and hopefully there. So that's one task. And then David, I think you're talking to maybe whether there's ways to work through existing networks or other events that you have with stakeholders to kind of bring the message to them, or are you talking about bringing those folks to these meetings, or both?
Both, and I'm still sorting out in my head what these opportunities are. But, for instance, BNRC convenes a group. I think, Charlie, you participate in this, and I know Ali does, the Forest Roundtable. That's an interesting mix of forest product sector, as well as academics, as well as nonprofit and public officials. I'm just thinking about some, in my mind, I'm starting to check through, like, who are people that I can, as we distill this information into concrete opportunities to engage, who do I send it to? And what is my message? I want to encourage, because I want to encourage people to substantively engage in these conversations, to come prepared, to offer suggestions, to have read, available information in advance, so that it's as useful as possible to the Climate Council, that the input isn't, because otherwise, what happens so often, even in our calls here, that the public opportunities they're broad, they're high level, and aren't really at the same kind of, they're not meeting where the subcommittee is in terms of informing our work. It's not that it's irrelevant, it's just perhaps not as informed as it could be. And there's also, like a business, I'm particularly thinking about small business people. Their lives are completely consumed, whether they're farmers or foresters or, whatever. They just don't have a lot of time. But if you tell them, like, read this, come to this meeting and speak, they can engage in ways that are really useful and provide insights that we otherwise might not have.
So David, just thinking about like additive events, which is what I've been calling them now, in that bucket of like what we're trying to accomplish. Originally, when the public engagement plan was first drafted, there was perhaps more of an emphasis on like using council members and subcommittee members to support outreach and engagement. And I hope that what we tried to do in the plan is really build the engagement and feedback around those 7 statewide events and focus our capacity with Climate Access and RISE there. However, we didn't also want to lose the value of all of you, your networks, the people that you're able to reach. And so at while it's not as prominent perhaps in the public engagement plan, I do think that that calendar is something that we're going to be working with all of you to build. And that collateral that they're now working on is really going to be thought about how easy it can be for all of you to take and do just what you said, like have the right materials to just send to folks ahead of time, bring with you to present, and then have, again, those feedback forms so that we can hear from those folks in a consistent way also. And so it's great to hear that you're excited about that. And I feel like it's a 50-50 response from subcommittees and council members around this. Like some subcommittee members are like, give me this goods, I want to go out and spread the word. And others are feeling really overwhelmed and we're like, don't ask us to do this, you have consultants to do this. So we were trying to thread that needle so that where folks want to step in and lead with that, they can, even though I will also say there was a concern about like how the message is spread. I think that that's just going to be the nature of like a body of work like this. Like you can't control the narrative to every component, and we have to consider all of you as ambassadors to communicate that work. So hopefully we can spend some more time with all of you going through what the stakeholder events look like, and then thinking about what these additive events that are already existing. And I really think for your constituents, maybe more than anybody else, like that's going to be important to plug into existing things. Like farmers, as an obvious group, are really busy people, and they're not going to want to come to a stakeholder meeting that we put on. They want us to go to them and meet them on their ground and bring information and hear from them. And so that's why I think these kinds of events are going to be so critical and important to keep talking about and adding to.
I want to flag that Iris put a comment in the chat about when, how, where we are going to start bringing in the guiding principles and rubrics to the work. So wanting to just put that out
definitely. And I think that's going to need to be front and center in our conversation next week with Pat, is kind of when we think about work planning, where, how we integrate that work in our kind of next steps. So thanks for reminding of that, Iris. But yeah, absolutely. That's, we've kind of thrown all these things in the pot. Now we need to make sense of them, and the guiding principles is going to be a really important tool for helping us, filter them out and modify them to meet those principles.
I think that's good. I would ask maybe that everyone just, if you haven't yet, read the whole thing, because I'm not sure that everyone has before the next meeting. I think that would be a good step if you haven't yet. So yeah.
Okay, so homework for next week. Please read through the entirety of the guiding principles document, which I believe is on the website under supporting documents. Yes, on the AOA Climate Council website. Please and thank you. I know all of you are great students.
Thanks, Teach. So we're pretty much at the end of this agenda item. Anything else folks want to bring up on this kind of broad public engagement topic, or anything else they want to share with the group? Great. Thanks, David, for bringing us back to that. So now we are on to setting our agenda and assignments for next week. I think the big assignment is the one that Abby just articulated and that Iris suggested, that folks refresh themselves with the full guiding principles document in advance of our conversation next week. Agenda wise, I see 2 or 3 primary tasks, and would encourage you all to share your thoughts one way or the other. But I think we'll need to have a structured conversation around the kind of visions, goals, kind of deliverables for the subcommittee. And then a conversation around the work plan and the integration of the guiding principles of how we bring our current set of pathways to an actionable suite of strategies. And I don't know, Jane, if there's anything else you need us to do from your perspective next week, but those seem like the big ticket items, and we welcome any input from others on topics you would like us to bring up. Okay. I do know at some point, we discussed wanting to hear from Jake and others around food systems and farm to plate. I think there's also some interest in hearing more about forest management, implications on carbon, forest processing, kind of products markets in the state. I think that maybe that's something that folks still think we want to do. Abby and I can give some thought to future meetings, but I feel like next week really digging into our visioning and work planning is probably a good use of folks' time. Okay, seeing some nods. Good. So we'll, Abby, Jane, and I will work on an agenda, but it'll probably follow those general outlines. Good. Everyone's just staring, so I think they agree. Okay, so just one kind of technical note, since I have everyone here, what is it, task group 5B, the natural working forested lands task group, we have one of our every other week meetings next Tuesday morning. Just want to see if folks feel the need to meet next Tuesday and kind of regroup on our strategies. If folks could use a little pause after a big lift we got to get here. So just want to talk now whether we all want to meet Tuesday morning or not. I'm happy to do it, but want to get your input.
I'm going to be unavailable for that
Okay.
one.
Same. I'm actually gonna be on vacation next week, Billy.
Okay. So Judy, happy to meet, but if you don't, all right, perfect. So you're out too. So we will cancel that meeting for next Tuesday morning. Thanks for obliging me. Glad I did it now. Okay, so barring any other comments from the subcommittee or staff, I think we'll move on to public comment. Everyone ready? Great. So thanks for your patience, members of the public who've been with us today. Anyone interested in addressing the subcommittee, please raise your Zoom hand or make yourself known otherwise. Got Zach. Okay, well, if some others may emerge between now and the end, but Zach, please feel free to take a few minutes to address the committee.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all. Zach Porter with Conservation Law Foundation. Just first off, I want to say I hope that in the future we might be able to create more space for public discussion or back and forth even, in these meetings. 5 minutes in the agenda at the end of a meeting with a lot of good content is a tough place to fit in, I think, substantive comment, and especially because the public has been prohibited from participating in the task groups. This is really the only opportunity to weigh in. So just want to flag that for consideration as you're building agendas in the future. I listened very intently to the carbon budget conversation today. Thank you for bringing Jillian in to give that, and thank you to Allie as well. I wanted to just follow up by saying I'm going to send along to the subcommittee papers addressing some of these concerns that I have about the way that the carbon budget is being prepared right now. But I'm worried that we're going to be missing a lot of really important carbon emission sources, and that we're not necessarily looking at even some of the very latest science. We mentioned Jonathan Thompson. I think Jane mentioned Jonathan, that she's working with him on something that might not be completed until after this climate action plan is done. Its first draft is done. He has a paper that came out in 2019 that shows that it's actually the intensity of timber harvest, not the extent of forest cover, that is the greatest determining factor of above ground forest carbon in the Northeast. So I really took issue a bit with the suggestion that it's this kind of tree cover that's the greatest concern here in Vermont. We need to be looking at forest impacts from timber harvest as the #1 factor in driving carbon flux in Vermont's forest. That is fact, and there's excellent science backing that up right now. We already have that. We don't need to wait for another study to come out in order to include that information in the analysis that we do here. I also just want to raise another point. There's so much more to say than in the time that I have here today, but the biomass renewable energy standard is taking comments right now. Today's the last day for comments on that. This is putting the cart before the horse here. Soliciting comments on a renewable energy standard that was supposed to be done 6 years ago. This climate action plan should be giving the state guidance on how it wants to proceed with biomass use going forward. It shouldn't be the other way around. And so what's about to happen is we're going to get direction on biomass before you all have a chance to weigh in on that matter. So I hope that you will take alarm from that and put a pause on the biomass RES process that's going on right now. I'd love to say more, but I want to be respectful of the other members of the public who are here today. And so I'll stop, but thank you. And I do look forward to follow-up conversations, and I will send an email with the papers that I mentioned earlier, getting at a lot of these forest carbon issues that I just mentioned. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Allie, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, Zach, I appreciate the feedback, but there was a little misconstrued, I think, the results there. So forests are the most important thing for carbon stocks, right? So for standing carbon, carbon storage, but yeah, certainly that was a statement for carbon sequestration or carbon flux, right? So, kind of different components that are talking about. And also, we did invite Jonathan Thompson to participate. He reviewed the complete document that I created and said that he would follow the same methodology. So that was part of that. So this does include harvesting, timber harvest, land use change, all of the various management components on our forest. So it's really comprehensive to that. It doesn't, including combustion of wood for biomass and energy.
Thanks, Allie. Any other members of the public care to share any thoughts or comments at this time? Okay. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your focus and hard work again today. Have a great weekend. Allie and I will get an agenda out hopefully early next week so you all can chew on it a bit before we meet. Please do read over the guiding principles document, and we will see you all next Friday. Great. Thanks, everyone.